The end of the war left Germany grappling with the remnants of its ensemble armament factories, now transformed into symbols of destruction and disarray. As the Allies divided the country, factories were either dismantled, repurposed, or left to decay. Yet, amid this industrial collapse, the question remained: how would the sites of war production be reshaped in a world rebuilding from devastation? With both Soviet and Western powers having different visions for the future, the fate of these factories would become a pivotal element in the struggle to rebuild Germany's economy and identity. What was once built for destruction would now be reformed for survival. At the end of the war, a country defeated by its own ambition found itself awash in the remnants of its war machine. Factories that had once churned out tanks, aircraft, and ammunition now stood silent, their purpose dissolved by the collapse of the Reich. The war had not only decimated cities and landscapes but had also left behind an industrial web designed for destruction. The German armament factories, those colossal engines of war production, were no longer needed. But their fate was far from simple. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Germany was left in a state of profound uncertainty. Its infrastructure was shattered, its workforce devastated, and its economy in ruins. The factories that had powered the war effort, once the heartbeat of a nation at war, were now unwanted relics of a darker past. Yet, the scale of the destruction created new dilemmas. What to do with the thousands of factories scattered across the country? What could be salvaged, repurposed, or ultimately scrapped? By 1945, the scale of the damage to Germany's industrial base was immense. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden were little more than rubble. Yet, the country's industrial production during the war had been extraordinary. Germany's vast network of armament factories, including the notorious ones in the Ruhr Valley, had produced nearly 40,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and millions of small arms. These factories were technologically advanced and strategically critical, designed for the efficient mass production of weaponry. But now, these factories faced a grim fate. The Allies, both the United States and the Soviet Union, took immediate steps to control what remained. They recognized the potential danger of leaving such powerful manufacturing capabilities in the hands of a defeated enemy. At the same time, the Allies' economic interests in post-war Europe shaped their decisions. The dismantling and destruction of German industry was seen as a way to prevent any resurgence of military power. The factories needed to be eliminated or repurposed for peaceful purposes, but the question remained: how? One of the first actions was the systematic dismantling of factories. This was a colossal undertaking. In the Western zones, under American and British supervision, factories were either destroyed or disassembled and shipped to other countries as war reparations. Entire lines of production, designed for the creation of war materials, were moved to the Soviet Union, where they were reassembled for the USSR's own use. However, the Soviets took a different approach. In their zone of occupation, they sought to make use of the industrial capacity, extracting whatever they could to fuel their own post-war rebuilding. Some German factories were even restarted under Soviet supervision, but the process was far from smooth. Meanwhile, in the American-occupied zones, a policy of industrial disarmament was quickly put into place. The Allies were determined to reduce the chance of a future war by limiting the industrial capacity of Germany. For this reason, factories that could no longer be converted to civilian uses were destroyed. In many places, the once vibrant industrial hubs became ghost towns, their machines dismantled and their buildings left abandoned. This was the grim reality for many factories in cities like Essen, where the famous Krupp steelworks, once the heart of the Nazi war effort, was partially demolished. Despite the Allied efforts, some factories managed to survive, but their purpose had shifted. In the American and British zones, some industrial plants were repurposed to produce civilian goods. One notable example was the conversion of the former armament works in the city of Düsseldorf, where machinery originally designed for producing tanks was adapted to make machinery for industrial use. The scale of this conversion was vast, but it represented a small fraction of what had been destroyed. The production of military-grade equipment was essentially over, but the factories remained in some form, their former purpose a shadow that loomed over their new work. However, it was the Soviet approach that stood out for its sheer scope and pragmatism. In their effort to rebuild their own war-torn economy, they not only seized vast amounts of German equipment but also worked to revive the factories themselves. Under Soviet control, these once proud war production sites were put back to work, albeit for different ends. The machinery of death would now churn out the tools of reconstruction: industrial machinery, civilian vehicles, and other non-military products. However, this process was fraught with difficulty. Soviet engineers struggled with the unfamiliar and often outdated technology. But the sheer scale of the operation meant that, despite these challenges, substantial amounts of German industrial output were absorbed into the Soviet system. Yet, for all the grand plans of the Allies, many factories were left abandoned, victims of an economic system that could no longer sustain their existence. Cities like Berlin, once centers of wartime production, became somber reminders of what had been lost. A once vibrant industrial base was reduced to a collection of broken machinery and neglected structures. Even in places where factories were repurposed, they never fully regained their wartime efficiency. The machinery was often outdated, worn out by the war, or stripped for parts. The very process of converting these factories to civilian uses often involved tearing apart machines that had once been the pinnacle of industrial engineering. The transition was not smooth, nor was it uniform across the country. In some regions, the factories were quickly decommissioned, either due to the lack of materials or because they were deemed unnecessary for reconstruction efforts. In others, particularly in the western zones, efforts were made to retain some industrial capacity for the growing demand for reconstruction. The process of rebuilding Germany's economy after the war, particularly in the West, would prove to be slow and laborious, with many industries struggling to restart. This process of industrial dismantling and repurposing was further complicated by the political and ideological divisions that quickly emerged between the Allies. The division of Germany into occupation zones meant that different policies were applied depending on whether a factory was located in the Soviet-controlled East or the American-controlled West. The Western Allies, focused on rebuilding a democratic Germany, often had different priorities from the Soviets, who were intent on using whatever resources they could extract from their occupied zones to strengthen their own economy. This ideological divide meant that even the fate of individual factories could hinge on their location and the occupying power's priorities. In the midst of this chaos, some factories managed to avoid complete destruction. Those that had been involved in civilian production, or that had been located in less strategically important areas, were sometimes spared from the bulldozer's blade. These factories, often forgotten in the larger story of post-war destruction, slowly began to return to civilian production. But even these factories, now producing goods for a world recovering from the devastation of the war, were forever marked by their past. The broader economic impact of this post-war industrial transformation was enormous. The loss of Germany's armament factories, the dismantling of its war production capabilities, and the conversion of its remaining industries had profound consequences not only for Germany but for Europe as a whole. The rebuilding of the German economy would take years, and many factories would never again reach the heights they had once known during the war. But even as these factories were torn down, repurposed, or left to rot, the story of the German armament factories did not end. They remained as a symbol of the incredible industrial capacity that had powered the war and a reminder of the forces that had shaped the 20th century. What had happened to these factories after the war was not just a matter of economics, but of history. A history of power, destruction, and the complex process of rebuilding in a world forever changed. The aftermath of the war, while leaving Germany in ruins, also sowed the seeds for its eventual economic recovery. But the fate of the German armament factories continued to unfold across different regions, revealing stark contrasts between the approaches taken by the Allies. In the East, under Soviet control, the factories were often used to serve the needs of the communist regime, which sought not only to extract war reparations but also to establish a Soviet-style industrial base. The machinery, though outdated in some cases, was repurposed to fuel the demands of a new order. Factories that had once produced tanks and artillery now churned out civilian goods, yet their original function was never far from the surface. Soviet engineers, familiar with the industrial techniques of the time, faced significant challenges in converting the machinery, but the sheer scale of the effort made the task feasible. In stark contrast, in the West, the American and British approach was dominated by a vision of peace and reconstruction. Germany's economy had been largely dismantled by the Allies, with a large proportion of the armament factories destroyed or disassembled. However, the need to rebuild quickly was undeniable. Under the Marshall Plan, which had been introduced in 1948, the Allies sought to restabilize Europe by providing substantial aid to Germany, among other nations. This aid included not only material resources but also access to modern machinery and technology that would replace the old war production lines. The armament factories that had survived or been repurposed now became the backbone of Germany's transition into a post-war economy. Those still producing military equipment were strictly monitored, while civilian manufacturing surged ahead. In many cases, older war factories were retooled for the burgeoning automobile, chemical, and consumer electronics industries. These factories, now producing goods for a peacetime world, represented the slow but steady recovery of West Germany. However, the process of repurposing Germany's armament factories was never seamless. In some areas, the transition was hindered by a lack of skilled workers, machinery, and raw materials. The factories had been designed for the mass production of tanks, aircraft, and weapons, not for consumer goods. The process of converting these lines was slow, and often not without complications. Yet, in the long run, this effort would prove to be a vital step in West Germany's economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s. One of the more notable examples of the transformation of these factories was the conversion of the vast industrial complex in the Ruhr Valley. The valley, which had once been the center of the German war industry, became a focal point for post-war reconstruction. With the war factories reduced to rubble or abandoned, the region faced an uphill battle. Yet, under the guidance of the Allied-controlled Economic Council, the Ruhr began to slowly rebuild. Steel plants that had once produced the material for war machines were transformed into steel mills that supplied Europe's post-war needs. The process of conversion was arduous, and the economic strain was evident, but the Ruhr would go on to become a symbol of German recovery in the early Cold War years. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the division of the city into East and West left the fate of the factories split between two ideologically opposing systems. The East, under Soviet occupation, became a zone where the old war factories were not only re-employed but re-engineered for the Soviet bloc's industrial output. However, the lack of modernization and investment meant that these factories could never reach the levels of productivity they had once achieved under Nazi Germany. The struggle for economic stability in East Germany during the 1950s would be marked by these industrial challenges, and the factories that had once produced armaments became symbols of an economy trying to catch up to its Western counterparts. In the West, the transformation of former military factories into commercial production lines was part of a broader effort to reintegrate Germany into the global economy. As part of the Allied-controlled economic policy, a large number of German industrialists and engineers were brought back into the fold to help with this transition. Many of them, who had once worked in armament production, now turned their skills to civilian goods. This industrial expertise would later play a key role in the formation of the German model of industrial efficiency that would become internationally renowned. However, the process of rebuilding was not without its challenges, and many workers faced difficult adjustments. Factories that had once been places of fear and labor in support of the war machine now became centers of hope for a different kind of productivity, one that would rebuild homes, supply goods, and fuel the engines of peace. Yet, despite the successes of conversion, not all the German armament factories survived in any form. Many, especially those in smaller towns or more rural areas, simply ceased to exist. For these factories, the post-war era brought with it an inevitable end. Their buildings stood empty, and their machines were either sold off or scrapped. In the larger cities, particularly in the American and British zones, many factories were repurposed for civilian use, but the scale of the task meant that not every facility had a chance to be saved. The cost of rebuilding and modernizing these factories, combined with the necessity of meeting the demands of the rapidly changing global economy, meant that some factories simply couldn't compete in the new peacetime world. In the Soviet-controlled zone, the factories that remained were repurposed for a different kind of industrialization, one that sought to supply the needs of a centrally planned economy. However, the demands of the Soviet system often clashed with the old technologies that still dominated much of Germany's industrial landscape. The early years of East Germany's existence were marked by these economic difficulties, and the industrial base, including many of the former armament factories, struggled to adjust to the new demands placed upon it. What is often lost in the story of the post-war recovery is the toll this process took on Germany's workforce. The factories, which had once been sites of intense industrial activity, now stood idle or were repurposed. For the workers who had labored within these factories, the transition was not always smooth. Many had spent years in the armament industry, and now they faced the challenge of reorienting themselves to new tasks. The mental and emotional toll of these adjustments was often overlooked in the rush to rebuild the nation. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as the Cold War began to take shape, the division of Germany into East and West became more pronounced. While the West moved toward rebuilding a capitalist economy, the East struggled under the weight of Soviet control. The former armament factories that remained in the East were not only outdated but were also now part of an industrial system struggling to meet the demands of its political masters. The success of West Germany's recovery, marked by its industrial boom, cast a long shadow over the challenges faced by East Germany, where many factories had been left to rot or were inefficiently repurposed. By the mid-1950s, West Germany had begun to emerge as an industrial powerhouse once more. The factories that had survived the war, or those that had been successfully converted, now produced everything from automobiles to household goods. The ruins of war were transformed into engines of productivity. Yet, this success came at a cost. The deep scars of the war were still felt in the factories, and the workers who toiled within them carried the memories of the destruction that had once defined their daily lives.